Walking along a trail at the roots of Pikes Peak, a strain of music won't leave your head. Your boots stomp in rhythm to a concerto, whatever, in your mind as the trail winds past a little brook toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a riotous conversation about the arts, faith, and why on earth Colorado Springs has so many castles. At the corner table, by the fire, you see three people. One of them is asking the other two about the difference between a fiddle and a violin. And that's me, your co-host, Matt Melma. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. Each spring we have our big Imagination Redeemed conference, which attracts folks from all across the country. Seriously, if you haven't bought your tickets, do it now. You're probably running out. Seconds are ticking away. Do it. We also have a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. And when the artists in that guild aren't creating art, some of us like to podcast. And that's how we have the Believe to See table in the Anselm Society Digital Pub. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. You should also check out our Facebook page where we have a ton of new and interesting content to engage with that's coming out all the time. And you should also check out Anselm's two other podcasts. Since you're already doing stuff, maybe rate and review the show on iTunes with a 5-star review or, wherever you get your podcasts. That helps us a ton by increasing the visibility of the show, and, I think it's your good deed for the day or whatever, but, whatever, I don't know. Also, our show is brought to you with the help of Wolf & Key Marketing, a Colorado Springs-based digital marketing agency that helps forward-thinking businesses thrive in the age of the internet. Whether it's through a new website, better social media presence, or any other highly targeted digital strategies, Wolf & Key brings a tailored approach to each of their clients in order to create real business growth. Wolf & Key, purpose over profit. So let me throw it over to my co-host today, Terri Moon. First of all, Terri, concerto.
Concerto. Yes. It's an Italian word.
Yeah, can I also tell you?
Sure.
I learned maybe 2 or 3 years ago that a fiddle and a violin are the same thing.
Well.
Oh, is it not?
Well.
Oh, good. Please do tell.
Here is the real answer to that. It is. A fiddle is carried in a sack, and a violin is carried in a case. That's the difference.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if there's some scientific line, what kind of music does it have to be for it to be a fiddle or a violin?
No, really, it's exactly the same thing, but we like to tease about that a little bit.
So you could be first chair fiddle in a concert.
Sure.
Okay.
Why not?
Could you have a fiddle in a concerto?
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Well, that's really nice. So really quick, I have been rereading the Lord of the Rings books, because I'm in Anselm and it's the rules. I hadn't actually read all the books since I was in high school, so now I'm going back through them and picking up on all these new things. One of the things that really stuck out to me is how much I belong as a hobbit. You'll have people there's these, silly internet quizzes what Lord of the Rings characters are you? And everyone's always I'm an elf because I'm beautiful and wise. Okay, whatever. I'm a hobbit, and I realized this when I was reading a passage in Bilbo's party at the beginning. It was talking about how the hobbits, after they'll have their formal meals at the party, then they'll have their informal meals where they're just loading their plate with food. Then, toward the very end, they have a process called filling in the cracks, which is where you get a plate with all the little pastries and desserts in a drink, and that's just, you fill in the cracks at the end of the day. And I read that, I was these are my people. So, Terri, what kind of Lord of the Rings race would you be? You can say elf, I won't make fun of you too much.
Okay, Tom Bombadil.
Whoa, yeah. Whoa, okay.
He was the musician.
Oh man, that is a curveball. I like it.
Yeah. So okay. In fact, he he was pretty influential in the story. And I think his ability to see how the world could be shaped with music was pretty awesome.
Wow, I like it. That is the first Tom Bombadil I've ever heard for that. Okay. So who else may have some Tom Bombadil-ish qualities?
Yes.
A guy I know, or I've heard of, by the name of Bach. Bach.
Oh, totally.
Do you think he's a Tom Bombadil too?
The ultimate Tom Bombadil, yes.
Well, let's bring in someone else to get a third opinion here. So our guest at the table today is Greg Brown. Hello, Greg.
Hello.
So, Greg, before we can talk about Tom Bombadil some more, I guess, but why don't you tell us who you are and what you do arts-wise?
Yeah, so I'm a bassoon player and a hammer dulcimer player. I live here in town in Colorado Springs and have played pretty much everywhere. I played in the Air Force Academy Band and the Air Force Band in Washington, D.C. for many years, and now I play and some pub nights.
Yep.
Have you played at previous pub nights and I just missed you?
Yes.
All of them.
Oh man.
St. Patrick's Day, especially.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
So
the St. Patrick's Day pub.
Yes, and I don't know when this podcast will be aired, but we are getting ready right now for the next St. Patrick's Day pub night.
So I think this will air short, like a couple weeks after. I could figure it out with simple math.
I already missed it.
Well,
Too bad.
Oh, man. Well, I hope they feel duly ashamed and guilty and won't make that mistake again.
We're going to have so much fun.
But the reason we have our two musicians here, the bassoonist,
Yes.
bassoonist, and the violinist,
Yes.
okay, is to talk about someone who really fits really well with our theme for this quarter. And just a reminder, the theme that we have this quarter is the Centric Genius. The idea that we've got sort of this very recent modern innovation that the artist should be this sort of weirdo loner on the fringes of society who doesn't really fit in. But we as Christian artists don't have the option of being a weirdo loner. We're called to be a part of communities, family, church communities, all sorts of things. So what does it look like to be an artist within a community? So that is what we are looking at. And I believe, Terri, this was your idea to use Bach as sort of a picture of what this could look like.
Yes, because I've really loved the podcast. It's been so fun to listen to you guys talk about this concept of the Centric Genius. But so far I haven't heard you explore like an actual Centric Genius from history. So that's why I thought we have to talk about Bach with this, because he's the ultimate Centric Genius.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you. Like, so far we've sort of been talking, kind of in the abstract about, maybe our experiences, but sort of experience of artists in general. But now we can really focus on one particular person. So maybe before we get into Bach as the Centric Genius, we should talk about what we know of Bach and how he's impacted our lives. And you two will have more to say about this since you are the musicians. But Greg, can you maybe tell us a little bit about the impact that Bach has had on you?
So I first encountered Bach really in high school. And these were the original switched on Bach and well-tempered synthesizer recordings.
No way.
Yeah, Walter Carlos on the Moog synthesizer. And I played those endlessly. Of course, they were LPs then, wore out those two records. What I learned later was that those were actually really good performances of Bach. Now, Walter Carlos had his fun with sounds and synthesized sounds and stuff, but the performances of Bach, of the music itself, were really quite fine. And I've realized that over the years as I've gotten to know more recordings of Bach that, wow, he really did a good job.
It was like the Swingle Singers. Remember the Swingle Singers?
Yes.
Could sing. They would sing an instrumental piece, and it sounded awesome. And then who's the guy that used to do the instrumental pieces, just one single voice? Dadgum.
Oh,
I feel bad
yeah.
I can't remember him.
Right.
But he will sing like a solo cello sonata, just solo himself singing, and on like do 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 bop bop bop, that kind of stuff.
Oh man!
But I think this is going to come up later, part of Bach's genius.
Because his music is the only music I can think of the way where you can take a piece that was originally written for the organ, say, and sing it with a choir, and it works. It's pretty amazing.
Or play a piece that Bach wrote for the cello on the bassoon. That was my second encounter with Bach.
Okay.
So I was getting a master's degree, music degree, and I needed a piece for a recital. And I'd heard of bassoonists doing the cello suite. So I looked one up. Back in those days, you had to go to the music library, the university library, and photocopy the things out of the giant complete works of Bach. So I got it, and I just fell in love with his first cello suite. So I played that on the recital. And I have one more little chapter in my initial Bach story. So my wife Nancy and I both went to school in Southern California, University of Redlands. We got married. We both were from the Phoenix area, so we got married right after college in Phoenix. So we're standing in the reception line, and I start to hear music playing, and it's oboe. My wife Nancy's an oboist. Oboe and bassoon music. And I was like, did somebody find a recording of us playing? And I look over, and our bassoon and oboe professors from college had driven over from California and were playing a piece that my teacher, John Steinmetz, wrote, and he entitled it Love Song, but what it really was a sort of a working out for two instruments of the double minuet from the first cello suite.
Oh man, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's really cool. That's a cool story.
That is a good story. Huh. So a couple quick questions along there. So I am guessing, if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know I know an embarrassingly little amount about classical music or music in general or anything beyond dragon stories. But I am guessing that it is not typical to find a piece written for a cello that can be performed by a bassoon. Is that correct?
Well, they do play in the same range, basically, except for the cello has a much bigger range than the bassoon. And the cello can do all kinds of technical things that are very difficult on the bassoon. But again, that's part of Bach's genius, and that his music can be played on all kinds of things. I played the prelude to that cello suite on the hammered dulcimer. And it's really hard on the hammered dulcimer. But I heard Bella Fleck do it on the banjo, and
Chris Thiele plays the violin sonatas.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And what you said about the voices, when you described that to me, because I'm a podcasting professional, I didn't laugh, but I wanted to because that sounded so funny. He's like, yeah, I'm going to sing the works of Bach, all the parts by myself. I mean, that sounds like an SNL sketch, but I guess it works.
Yes.
I remember the name of the guy. Bobby McFerrin.
Yes, Bobby McFerrin. Go look him up.
I may be doing a YouTube search of that after this. So, Terri, tell me about your experiences with Bach.
Okay, well, like Greg, every violin student is given Bach to learn at some point. It's like you cannot learn to be a violinist without it. But I had a really fun experience when I was, after I'd finished my master's degree, I was invited to go and study music for a year in Amsterdam. It was so cool. So many things I could tell you about that experience, but one of the highlights for me was I got invited to go with a little Dutch group of musicians. It was a small orchestra. I was playing in the orchestra. We were all playing on like historically, performance approved instruments. So it was a replica of the type of violin that would have been used during Bach's time period.
Oh, that's cool.
And a small choir. And we prepared to perform one of the really famous pieces by Bach for choir and orchestra. It's called the Magnificat. It's basically the Song of Mary, when Mary meets Elizabeth and she gives this whole wonderful, wonderful poem. It's that set to music. So we prepared that and we set off for Leipzig. And the year was 1985. Long time ago, Matt. How old? You were like not born yet, right?
I was almost born.
Oh my gosh. So it was 1985. Now what was significant about that was Bach was born in 1685.
Oh.
So this was a 300th birthday celebration for Bach. And we went to Leipzig, which is the town where Bach lived and worked, spent much of his later part of his career. He was the chief musician at the church called the Thomaskirche, which was there in Leipzig, a very prominent Lutheran church. So there was a festival of music in honor of Bach's 300th birthday, and we got to perform in that festival. The other thing that's interesting about 1985, you guys will, if you think back and remember, this was before the Berlin Wall came down.
Oh, yeah.
Leipzig was East Germany at that time.
Oh.
And it was actually a pretty remarkable thing that even the government allowed them to do this church music festival in Leipzig.
Yeah.
In the course of the time that I was there, I was in the Thomaskirche. I was walking around thinking, oh my gosh, like Bach was here. This was where he lived. And as I was thinking that, I just happened to be standing in the area of the church called the choir, which, is where all the musicians would have been. And I'm thinking, gosh, what would it have been like to have been here in the 1700s and be in Bach's choir? And I looked down on the floor, and right at my feet was this great big brass plate with his picture on it, and 1685 to 1750. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's like buried right here under my feet.
You were literally walking over his bones.
I was walking on Bach. So that was an amazing experience.
Walk on Bach. That could be a good tourist attraction.
Switched on Bach.
There we go.
Such a thing. That's a thing.
That is really, really cool. And one of the cool things about it, especially which we'll get into a little later in the podcast, is this church wasn't just like a place he happened to show up every now and then in between his real work. That's where he did his real work.
Pretty much, he lived there pretty much, because not only did he have the job of, he composed a piece of music for every single Sunday to go with the scripture readings that were going to be given that day. Now, I'm not trying to say that he composed a new piece every week. He recycled some of his pieces, and he spent months on special things like Easter. But there was a piece composed by him in the church service every single Sunday. But he was also in charge of rehearsing all the musicians, hand copying all the parts, and as if that wasn't enough, they threw in extra, by the way, you have to teach Latin to the choir boys too.
And he was the organist.
Yes.
And was a master organ technician and builder.
Yeah, he was known all over Europe as one of the greatest organists of his time.
Oh, that's amazing. I just picture hey, Bach, I know you're a genius composer or whatever. Can you teach Latin to these oily-faced 12-year-olds? I think that's a great use of your time.
Yes.
I don't think he ever liked doing that.
Right.
Records of disputes with church officials and town officials complaining about his pay and his work and all kinds of things.
Yep.
Real man living a real life, having to deal with real brat 12 and 13-year-olds.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so like I said, we'll get into that in more depth, but first of all, let me say, one of the many benefits of having Terri on the pod, having her over to the table, usually for shows, I'll kind of do some of the research, get some show notes, get an outline, send it out to people, but for this one, Terri sent them out to me, and I reviewed them. I was like, hey, this is great, let's just do this. So you have this outlined, and I like the way you did it.
All right.
So basically, Terri outlined it, Bach as a centric genius, in two parts, establishing first, he was a genius, and second, that he was centric. So let's do that.
All right.
I feel like you guys are going to have a lot of material to work with, but Terri, explain to us why Bach was a genius.
Why was he a genius? Okay, I'm going to give you a quote, okay, because it shouldn't just be in my words. Yeah, I guess you can kind of already tell that I love Bach's music. But here is what the radio host of BBC's radio said about him. Actually, it's for a number of years they've featured music by Bach before 7 o'clock in the morning. They call it Bach Before 7. And somebody was asking him, why are you doing this? And here was his answer. Bach's instinctive understanding of human nature, his rhetorical skills, and his innate skill as a dramatist are second to none. Living from 1685 to 1750, he was employed by the church to write music to the glory of God. And yet, everything that it is to be human, to love, to lose, to laugh, to be betrayed, to betray, to be torn into little pieces, or to feel so whole that you could fly, is here. Conflict, friendship, despair, joy, his music encompasses what I can only describe as the everythingness of everything. Even Shakespeare cannot compare.
I love that. Makes me think of I was reading somebody talking about like the Psalms and talking about how just going through the Psalms will get you through the range of every human emotion, where it's all there. It's sort of seeing Bach echo that as somebody creating music within the church. Like doing that, it's not such like, oh, you write sacred music. It's this tiny little box outside, sequestered from the real world. It's like, no, if you write music as part of a church, you're going to write music that touches on pretty much every human emotion.
Right.
Okay, so that's a pretty good case that you first set up.
Yes. Now, Greg, you should tell them though about the vote that was taken amongst current composers today.
Can I tell you? Can I tell you really quick first? As soon as we started getting into this, I started thinking. Do you guys remember that scene in A Charlie Brown Christmas when Lucy and Schroeder are talking about Beethoven, and Lucy's like, "You just keep talking, Schroeder, about how great Beethoven was. Beethoven wasn't so great." Then Schroeder's like, "What do you mean Beethoven wasn't so great?" Okay, Greg, what do you mean Bach wasn't so great?
Well, BBC Magazine recently asked 174 of today's best-known composers to list their top 5 composers.
Yep.
And essentially what happened was Bach came out on top. Of all the composers, Beethoven, Brahms, Stravinsky, Bach ends up on top.
Everyone's list.
Wow.
Yeah. It's pretty hard to top that.
It is.
Matt.
You're starting to convince my inner Lucy.
Okay.
What else you got? Terri?
Well, what about Albert Einstein? You want to know what he said?
He was okay.
Yeah, he's pretty smart. He's a smart guy. He said, I love this. You know, a lot of people don't know that Einstein was actually a violinist. Did you know that?
I did not.
Yes,
no.
he was. It's kind of known that he would, when he was stumped on a mathematical problem, which is very hard to imagine, he would go play his violin, and it would kind of get the creative juices flowing, and all of a sudden he would have a eureka moment.
Yeah, I do hear that theory of everything thing kind of got him in a funk toward the end.
But this is what he said. This is what I have to say about Bach. Listen, play, love, revere, and keep your trap shut.
Well, what more can you say after that? Really quick, I find that interesting with the whole Einstein and violin thing, where I was reading this book recently, it's called Range, because, I don't know, I had a long card.
That too. I love it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things it says is that we think that it's best to kind of sequester ourselves into one little niche. Like for the music realm, it's like, okay, I play the violin, I play only the violin, nothing but the violin. But really, people who are very successful will develop a broad range of skills. Then they'll figure out, oh, I can incorporate these things I learned here, these things I learned here, and whoa, it turns out I'm the best at the violin. That's cool. So, and getting into scientists, a lot of the top scientists are more likely than average to do things like play an instrument, perform in like the local play. Having range is a good thing. Remember that, artists.
Yes.
Read outside your genre if you're a writer. Do other things.
Go listen to some music, you writers.
Oh, that's a good idea too.
And musicians do something other than practice.
Yes, really.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing, but sort of an issue that we touch on a lot here at the show is this relationship, this sort of constant tension that a lot of artists live in, I think, where on the one hand, it's very easy to, denigrate your own talents, think, oh, I'm the worst, I'm no good, like, look at this stuff, I, wrote this, I performed this, but all these other people do it so much better. Whereas instead of encouraging us to, keep practicing and developing our skill, it's easy to be like, well, I guess I'm bad, so I'll just, go play video games or whatever. So there's that temptation. Then there's an opposite temptation, which I'm guessing Bach probably felt when you realize, oh, this stuff I'm doing is really good. Am I special? I must be better than people. I have a gift.
He was a proud, arrogant kind of person. Well, he had the right to be, honestly.
Right. We don't have a whole lot of indication of that, although he had to have been tempted. I mean, he had to have known how good he was. Because not everybody could do what he did. Not everybody could write what he did in his day.
I think that's why he got frustrated with the city officials or the church officials that he would ask for, can I have just an extra like $5, once in a while for all this hard work I'm putting in? And they basically, no. I think he knew what he was doing was not just for the time in which he lived. I think he knew there was something great about it. But do you think he was arrogant because of that?
No. So like at the top of most of his pieces of music, maybe it's all of his pieces, he would write, Jesu Juva, Jesus help me. Mm-hmm. He didn't think that he was this, the eccentric artist, the great source, the conduit of great art. Mm-hmm. He was humbly asking God, help me.
Yes.
Help me complete this piece, this cantata for this Sunday, or whatever it was that he was working on.
I think he knew that anything that he could create that would be, really for God's glory, and that was his desire, he knew he couldn't do that without the help of the Holy Spirit. So, yeah, he saw himself as a person in need of God's grace.
But I do think he kind of didn't have a measure of how good he was. So you found this great quote where he's teaching a student to play the organ.
Yes.
And he says, organ playing is nothing remarkable. All one has to do is hit the right notes at the right time, and the instrument plays itself.
It's that simple.
So
it's that simple.
I'm going to try that with my bassoon students from now on.
Just pick the right notes, play them in your bassoon in the right order, and then you'll have the best symphony ever. It's that simple.
Yes.
Why haven't we all done this?
Right.
Yes,
Why have we made it so hard?
Yes,
I don't know.
I think he also said once to a student, well, you have 5 fingers on each hand just like I do. You'll do just fine.
So that reminds me, I apologize in advance, I'm going to make a sports ball analogy, but a lot of times you'll see players who are like all-time greats. So like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, were like all-time great basketball players. They became coaches and they were both really bad. And one of the things they were saying is that when you're an all-time great player, it's like, well, like Magic Johnson, he was a basketball savant. He'd be on the court, he had this like super intuitive idea of like where all the players should be at all times. So you assume, well, everyone should be able to do this, right? Well, just find this guy cutting. I can see him all the time. Why can't you? Oh, why can't you just make that shot? I do it all the time. So you wonder if Bach, who's dealing not with other professional basketball players, but was like with, again, some like pimple-faced 13-year-olds, like, I can do this. Why can't you? It's like, wait, you all don't have this, otherworldly talent? What's going on there?
Wow. You want to tell me about the bassoonist?
Oh, okay. It's time for...
It's time for the really great Bach joke.
So, bassoonists have always had a complicated relationship with Bach.
You have a hard life.
Because he didn't write as any solo music.
So sad.
I mean, I'm sitting here next to a violinist who has some great pieces by Bach, and we play bass lines. I mean, he wrote good bass lines.
Sorry.
But, so anyway, that's why I had to play a cello suite. But the complicated relationship goes all the way back to when Bach was about 20 years old. It was his first real job. And again, he was having to teach the choir kids and everything. But some of the students in his orchestra are actually older than him. They were like 21, 22.
Ooh, man, that's hard.
Yeah. So he's coming back from something one evening, walking down the street, and the bassoonist from his orchestra confronts him and shoves him and is complaining that Bach said that he played like a nanny goat, like a bleeding nanny goat.
Does that sound like a bassoon to you?
On a Baroque bassoon, that may very well have been true.
Really.
So Bach pulls out, they all wore these sort of decorative daggers. So he pulls out his decorative dagger.
More civilized time.
Yeah. And they end up rolling in the street, fighting, and people had to come along and separate them and stuff.
Yes.
So the town council leader, he has to go to this disciplinary meeting, and he defends himself. He really did play like a nanny goat. But they tell him, now you have to be nicer to your musicians. And,
wow. Yeah, so he worked with just Some ordinary human beings. You had to put up with just plain ordinary people.
Who play like nanny ghosts and apparently carry dagger. Everyone just has daggers. Because you never know when a fight to the death for honor is going to break out.
Right.
Wow, how far civilization's fallen since. But let me tell you, let me ask you this, Greg, because I'm peeking ahead in the notes here.
Yes.
So this can be like the last point we have on sort of Bach, the genius composer. There's a story that apparently you have from An Evening in the Palace of Reason. That's intriguing. Tell me about your journeys through the Palace of Reason. And isn't that where Sherlock Holmes keeps all of his memories in the latest TV show?
It may very well be.
Okay.
Yeah. However, Cumberbatch does not come into this story at all. So that's the title of a book.
Yep.
And I'm forgetting the name of the author.
Wait a minute.
Terri will find
here it is. It's James Gaines. James R. Gaines. And you guys, I would really highly recommend this book. It's a great book.
If you want an introduction to Bach, it's a really well-written book.
Yeah.
A lot of the other ones, the Bach books, are written by musicians and they get technical.
Yeah.
And if you're a musician, there's a lot of great books, but this is a really good one. Anyway, so he tells the whole book is about this story of Frederick the Great is the king at the time in that part of Germany. Mm-hmm. Frederick is in love with all things French, although he's a German king. Mm-hmm. He loves the new Enlightenment ideas. Voltaire is part of his court. Rousseau, and he summons old man Bach to come to his court, and he wants Bach to look at his new forte pianos. The keyboard instrument up to that time had been the harpsichord, and the forte piano was sort of the forerunner of our modern piano, yeah. So that's his pretense of getting Bach to come, but what he really wants to do, so Frederick was he was just a mean guy. He wants to embarrass Bach.
He wants to humiliate him.
Humiliate him, yeah, that's the right word. Mm-hmm. Because Bach represents the old style of music, the old Lutheran religion, and Frederick is beyond all that. So that's the pretense is come see my new forte pianos. But what I really want to do is humiliate him. So Bach shows up, really doesn't have a choice, and Frederick is showing him around and goes over to the forte piano and gives him a theme and he asks him, okay, let's hear you compose or improvise a fugue on this. Mm-hmm. So Bach listens to it, and it's an impossible theme. Now, I'm not a composer, but I know that some themes are much easier to improvise on than others. This one is full of chromatics. It has a tritone leap in it. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Bach sits down and on the spot improvises a 3-part fugue. And
a fugue, there are very rigorous rules about how a fugue can be done. Almost like, okay, you could say it's sort of comparable to, in the poetry world, like what's that really awesome poem that's hard to write? One of those. Like
this is when we need Jane here.
Yes.
Let's see, sonnet, sestina.
A sonnet, it has to be a certain number of rhyming lines, and you know what I'm talking about. The meter has to be just right. Well, a fugue is like that too. Very rules that you just can't break. Okay.
You compared it to he's playing 3 simultaneous games of chess. Blindfolded, winning them all at the same time.
Yeah.
So anyway, Bach finishes his fugue, and the court musicians, and Frederick has drawn all of the great musicians at the time into his court, including Bach's own son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, CPE Bach. So all of the musicians are just in amazement, and Frederick the Great gives him the polite clap and says, now let's hear a 6-part fugue. And Bach thinks for a minute and realizes the trap that he's in, and tells the king, that will take a little bit longer to work out. I have to do a few things on paper.
Oh, king. Oh, honorable king.
Yes. So he gets himself out of that. But what he does is he goes home, and even on the way home in the long, long carriage ride, he starts working out how to do this 6-part fugue and expands it out. He writes motets, he writes these incredible canons.
Trio sonatas.
And he finishes it with a big trio sonata, and it is what we now know as the musical offering. And it was Bach's musical offering back to the king.
With all kinds of symbolism, too. It was basically, I think, and this is what the book shows, this is why you have to go read this book. He shows that it was really Bach saying, this is my response as a Christian to the Enlightenment that you represent. It was the clash of two worldviews.
Oh, that is really interesting. So did the king finally relent, or he's like, now do a 9-part?
Yeah. Well, the story doesn't go beyond that part. But
yeah, I looked it up, actually. There is no composer that has ever written more than a 6-part fugue.
Wow.
That's the maximum that's ever been done, and Bach did it.
all right, so here's an interesting tidbit. Arnold Schoenberg, who was the 12-tone composer, the originator of 12-tone serial
Basically, he
music.
threw out tonality and said, let's get rid of like major and minor scales and just every note is equal.
Oh.
So he was at the beginning of the 20th century, but a huge admirer of Bach. He thought that this impossible theme had actually been composed by C.P.E. Bach.
Bach's
And
son.
Bach's son. Did C.P. If this is true, did C.P.E. want to embarrass his father in front of the king?
Or was he asked to do it?
Or was it your compulsion?
By Frederick?
And if that's true, here's my own little theory. So I said earlier that the theme had a tritone in it, and the tritone in music was known as diabolus in musica, the devil in music. So
What is a tritone, Greg? Because some of our listeners might not know that.
Yeah, I mean, I could explain it, but I don't want to right now, so you just go ahead and do it. Yeah.
You're a better singer than me, but I'll tell you what it is. So the perfect intervals in the middle of the scale are the 4th and the 5th.
Yeah.
But in between those is an augmented 4th.
So a perfect 5th is da 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 bum bum. So a tritone would be bum bum. Very dissonant.
Very dissonant. And so my own little theory is that CPE was saying, Dad, watch out. There's a trap here. And he put the tritone in so his dad would be like, oh, I got it. Something's not right here.
So one of the many morals of the story, King Frederick, kind of a jerk.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, man.
He did not end. His life did not end well.
Read the book. I mean, he was despicable.
Okay. Well, that was really interesting. So now let's pivot to Bach as, the great composer, the very polite embarrasser of jerk kings, to Bach as the human. Because, we touched on this a little bit, but Bach wasn't just a composer. He had a whole life, a whole eccentric life. So tell me a little bit about that, Terri.
Okay, well, for one thing, his life was anything but easy. He was orphaned at the age of 10. He was given into the care of his big brother to raise him. His big brother was also a musician, but honestly, I think he was kind of jealous. He was kind of jealous of Bach's Johann Sebastian, his abilities. And so he made it kind of hard for him to study music. He kept hiding the good music away and saying, no, you're not ready for that yet. Can't have that. And Bach would...
And then he gave Johann Sebastian a noogie and sent him to bed, and after giving him a swirly, right?
Exactly. So it was one of the famous stories of him at that time was he actually snuck away a big collection of manuscripts that he wanted to be able to play. And the only way he could play it, the only way he could get the music from his brother was to hand copy it. So he stayed up late at night by candlelight, like hand copying this, I don't know how many pages, pen and quill and ink and all that stuff. And then there's a story, one of my favorite things is the music that later on, when he grew up, his first wife, he loved her dearly. And but he was away for a while. He asked to go to hear, I think, some concerts by Buxtehude. So he was away from home. While he was away, he got word, hey, your wife is ill. Maybe you should head home. And traveling was all really difficult, so it took a long time. It took a while for him to get back home. He arrived home to find she'd been buried, like sick, dead, buried, all that before he even got home. And what they think is that was during the time period when he composed some of his most beautiful music for the solo violin. And the reason why this strikes me personally is that the title page of the set of sonatas and partitas that he wrote for violin, it says on the title page, "You are alone." Meaning it's one solo instrument, but there's another meaning to that too. But then he got remarried. Greg, you want to tell us about that?
And he ended up with 20 or 21 children. It depends on where you read.
Yes.
But even there, he's no stranger to death. 12 of them died before they reached adulthood.
Yeah.
So it was just, boy, you read it, it's just a time of death is everywhere. And you can hear that if you look at the texts in his cantatas and stuff. There's a lot about death and about the hope of heaven.
Hope of the resurrection.
And of the resurrection, that this is not all there is, this sorrow and this life.
And pouring out all those feelings to God in his music.
Yeah.
Oh man. Talk about all the people's like, I don't have time to settle down like this. 20 kids, that's very very much settled down.
A lot of them became composers.
Yeah.
4 were like pretty famous composers, and several. I learned that one of his daughters was a well-known soprano. And he took a lot of pains to actually teach his children music. He didn't just shuffle them off somewhere else when he was busy. I think he spent a lot of time with them, and we have pretty good evidence that they would sit around the table at night or after dinner, sit in the living room and read the Bible together. And he also wrote this bunch of beautiful music for his wife, his new wife, when he remarried, Anna Magdalena. He wrote a notebook full of music for her because she wanted to learn to play the keyboard.
Oh man,
it's beautiful.
That is good. So he was actually good dad and husband too.
I really think so.
Yeah.
But there's also, so in addition to that, there's also him sort of in his, doing kind of air quotes, his work setting, which was a work setting that very much had him enmeshed in things, right?
Okay, so we talk about the Protestant work ethic. Yeah, he was definitely Protestant, He's in the great Lutheran tradition 100 years after Luther, but I can't think of anybody else that wrote the amount of music that he wrote. I think I read one place that if you were to listen to Bach's music one after another, all the music that we have, now that's another thing because a lot of his music was lost. But if we listen to one after another, every piece, until you'd listen to every piece that he wrote, it would take you about a week.
Oh man.
To listen to it all.
Wow.
And when you play Bach, there is no bad Bach.
No, there's no junk in there.
Some of the other, what we think of as the great Telemann and Handel, some of the other...
Vivaldi, Vivaldi.
Yeah.
I knew a friend that said, Vivaldi wrote 100 concertos. No, he wrote one concerto 100 times.
So his contemporaries...
I can't wait to use that at like a cocktail party. Just have it up my sleeve.
His contemporaries wrote a lot of music too. That was the work ethic back when musicians or composers were craftsmen and not great artistes.
Yes.
But you play a lot of bad Telemann and bad Handel and bad Vivaldi. Not bad, but boring.
It's okay.
They're just chunking through the music. They're just marking time.
Yeah. Like when I teach my students to play the Bach sonatas, I have to really emphasize to them, now this is a piece of music where you miss one note, and no, you can't do that. Everybody knows you missed one note.
So, a question related to that. So, he would sometimes compose music for each week in the church. So, is he like doing that to like, I'm trying to figure out if he would be doing this to like match with the pastor's sermon, or is he like doing it in accordance with like the church calendar? What does that look like?
Definitely the church calendar.
Oh, that's cool.
So in this wonderful Lutheran tradition, there is every Sunday is part of a season, and it's basically designed to follow the life of Christ. Mm-hmm. You know, in 1 year span of time, you are told the story of the birth to the death to the resurrection of Christ and back again. And there's a specific set of scripture readings for each Sunday. So Bach had that he knew, that he'd inherited from his Lutheran tradition, and he knew what the themes were going to be. So he would compose, usually it was a cantata, called a cantata, and that would be a multi-movement piece of music, which would have a lot of different components. It would have some solo pieces, would have some instrumental pieces, would have some parts for the congregation to sing, like what we think of as a hymn today. That really, Bach kind of started that, honestly. Was kind of invented around the time period in which he lived.
Yeah, and that's another way that he's centric, it seems like. We talk about how he's centric in terms of his family life, centric in terms of his sort of job at the church, which led to really great things, sometimes very petty behavior, but he's enmeshed in that life. And then he's also enmeshed in this sort of broader musical tradition, in this broader church tradition that sort of feeds into the work he does.
Okay, so Greg, you got to say something about that. Why was Bach did he just think he was going to come up with something brand new today that, had never existed before? Or did he see himself as part of a tradition?
Well, he's sort of the culmination of the craftsman musician. He reaches back and uses Lutheran chorales, uses Renaissance music, and he does a lot of recycling of his own music. Not everything that comes off of his pen has to be an absolutely original work, because he's like this master carpenter or something, mm-hmm. who sees a great piece of wood that he didn't use before, and now he's gonna use it in the new thing that he's building. It's just happening constantly.
And it was considered a good thing in a composer at that time to be able to quote from the past, or refer to the past, or in a way have a conversation with what had gone on before. And he saw himself as part of that great tradition that he had inherited.
Yeah, I like that, the conversation with what had come before him and up to the present time. I think the thing that most artists would feel now, I have to do something absolutely original. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that was it's not that Bach never thought about it, but it just wasn't the driving force in what artists did then, at least what musicians did then.
Right.
And I've also found, because I've been trying to do this, in my little ways, but trying to ground yourself in the tradition that comes before you, not just what's hot on the market right now, but actually trying to center yourself or plant yourself in the bigger tradition. It leads to a lot of creativity, because then instead of just what's rattling inside my own brain, that's a pretty limited space. When I can draw on the tradition of the centuries before us and taking part in the most important and most eloquent conversations that have been going back and forth, that is really fertile ground for more creativity.
Yeah. I think Bach really proves that. I've always felt that he was so disciplined. He knew so well the fine art of counterpoint that he'd studied in the composers that came before him. But because he knew it so well, he knew the rules. Like, for instance, I was talking about the rules about the fugue. He knew the precise point where you could deviate from that just a little bit, and it would really be so amazing to the listener. Because the listener would be expecting a certain thing and be surprised by, oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting that chord right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're unfortunately running a little low on time, so I think we just have one more big point to get. So one of the things I found interesting, because, we talk about folks from the past who will create these really wonderful and insightful works of religious art. But then, there can be like an intersect, like, well, he's just doing his job. Everyone, at least pretended to be religious back then. So we know he wrote for a church, whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean he had like a personal faith or like that actually meant a lot to him. But it sounds like for Bach, we have some pretty strong indications that he did have a strong personal faith.
Yes. Go, Greg.
Well, he owned the complete works, maybe it's the complete Bible commentary of Luther. Mm-hmm. That was part of his, and many more.
3 volumes.
Yeah, many more theological works. Mm-hmm. And they had notes in the margins. His Bibles had notes in the margins. They weren't just things that sat on the shelf. They're things he used a lot.
Right, and he actually, this was a fairly new printing of the Bible, mm-hmm. with a theological commentary by a guy named Abraham Kalov, who was a student of Luther. And Bach actually went through it with a fine-tooth comb, and you can see in the notes and the margins, he actually found where there was some mistakes, and he corrected it in there. Isn't that cool?
That is cool. So did I read this right in your notes that they found his Bible in an attic in 1943 in Michigan? What's going on there?
Yes, so it was a German immigrant family that had this Bible. Yeah, and the owner was showing a visitor, hey, look at this cool old book I found in my attic. And showed it to him, and the guy, whoever it was, actually recognized Bach's handwriting, wow. His signature.
Whoa.
It's his signature. He had a really intricate, almost like a little medallion kind of signature, and he had written that on the inside, and this person recognized it and said, whoa, what else have you got in your attic? So yep, and it's now in a library in Concordia Seminary, so you can go see it if you want to.
That is crazy.
Yep, yeah, it was just discovered in 1934, which that's pretty recent.
I mean, yeah, in an attic in Michigan.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So hey, I got to read you one of the famous notes that he wrote in the margin in 2 Chronicles 5:13, which is I think that is where there's a story about what worship was supposed to have been like in the temple. Okay? And he wrote in the margin, where there is devotional music, God in his grace is always present.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And it seems like a good thought to close the podcast on. So, Terri, Greg, thank you both so much for coming here. This was so great. So maybe one final thing. Here's a question I was wondering, because, doing prep for the show, I was like, hey, I should listen to some Bach to sort of get in the mood. Then I type in Bach. There's so much.
Yes.
So if somebody's trying to dip their toe into the Bach waters, what's a good thing to start with?
All right. So here's something I've discovered recently. And I don't know the exact name, but you'll get it if you Google something, or don't Google, but go onto YouTube and search for Netherlands Bach Ensemble. It's something like that. You'll get it. And it's a group who are doing Bach on original instruments, and they have interviews with the conductor, with the musicians. You can get the original German libretto, you can get the English translation, and the performances are fabulous. So that's where I would go.
Oh, nice. Wow. And if you want to listen to, just one of my favorite pieces of music by Bach to just listen to is one of his 6 Brandenburg concertos. They're just so joyful and full of life, and you're going to love them. There's 6 of them.
You can get those on the Switched on Bach recording.
Yes, it's pronounced concertos, Matt.
Well, you learn something new every day. All right, so once again, thank you, Terri. Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate it. This was super interesting. And now, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that time is winding down in the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The pub goers are shuffling back to their homes, the fire's down to embers, and you've just drained the last of your final mug. Once again, if you want to learn more about the Anselm Society, visit us at anselmsociety.org and check out our Facebook page and our website for more content on arts, faith, and the Centric Genius. So on behalf of the Believe to See table, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.